Previously on Fictional, Edmond Dantes was falsely accused and sentenced to life in the dungeons of Chateau d'If because Danglars envied Edmond's job and Fernand Mondego envied his relationship with Mercedes. A guy named Caruso knew the accusations were false, but stayed quiet because he was scared. In Chateau d'If, a priest named Faria burrowed into his cell by accident, educated Edmond, and together they hatched an escape plan. On the night of their escape, though, Edmond heard a scream from Faria's cell. Edmond scrambled back through the escape tunnel to his friend the moment the screams reached him. He squeezed along the dirt routes they had formed across years of work, fearing the worst. Had they finally been discovered? Were the guards in the cell at their moment of escape? Edmond turned the familiar corner and climbed the remaining 20 feet to Faria's cell, only to find the place empty, save Faria on the bed. It's about to happen, Faria managed through clenched teeth. He struggled to tell Edmond that he had an illness. The medicine was hidden in one of the feet of his bed. It was a vial of red liquid. The priest would seize and foam at the mouth. His eyes would roll back in his head, and he would scream. It would be bad, but Edmond had to let that pass. When it looked as if he died, Edmond would need to force his mouth open with a knife and drop 8 to 10 drops down the man's throat. Edmond nodded, and it began. For 2 hours, Edmond held the seizing body of Faria, at times needing to put a blanket over his head to mask the screaming. When it was done, and Faria stiffened as if dead, Edmond took the knife and found the separation between the old priest's teeth. He barely managed to pry open a centimeter, but it was enough. With a slight twist of the knife, a few drops fell in. Within minutes, the old man's jaws relaxed, color returned to his face, and a faint sigh escaped from his lips. Then, a gasp. The priest couldn't yet talk, so he pointed feebly to the floor, to his clock. It was 7 a.m. They could already hear the guard's boots. Quickly, Edmond nodded and said he would be back as soon as he could. As he left Faria, he didn't care that they had missed their window of escape. He just prayed that his friend would be okay. After the jailer finished the breakfast routine, Edmond returned to Faria's cell through their tunnel and found his friend resting on his cot. The priest smiled weakly and thanked Edmond. Frankly, he was surprised to see Edmond. After all, he'd had the opportunity to escape. Edmond scoffed. There was no way he was leaving without Faria. The old man reached up from his bed and thanked the young man. But he told Edmond that he would have to escape without Faria now. His right arm and right leg were paralyzed. Even if he could drag himself to the sentry house, there was no way he could climb down a cliff and swim for miles. This illness was one that had killed his father and his father's father. There was no way of avoiding it. Both of them had suffered 3 attacks. Faria, so far, had experienced 2. As for Edmond, he had the priest's blessing to go. They had an escape plan, and Edmond could follow it through himself. And he could do it tonight. That wasn't something Edmond wanted to think about. This guy had given him a new life. He'd educated him, saved him from killing himself, and most of all, the priest was a friend. His only friend. There was no way Edmond would abandon him here while he still lived. The priest smiled faintly and thanked Edmond. But if that were the case, he had something else to tell him. Something he'd been keeping from the young sailor. Those millions the guards joked about, all that money the poor priest had tried to use to bribe everyone, it was real. It was time to tell Edmond about the treasure. I'm Jason Weiser. From Bardic, this is Fictional. Oh yeah, a treasure. That's real great, buddy, Edmond said to his only friend, who was evidently not going gently into that good night. Okay, focus. I know what you're thinking, Faria said. Whenever people hear of a poor priest ranting about millions of dollars stashed on an island, they start handling me with kid gloves. I'm not crazy. Yeah, no, buddy, it's okay. How about you get some sleep? You had a long night, Edmond said, crying inwardly that Faria was deteriorating so quickly. Faria barked at him. Stop it. Come on. Look at this. He produced a burned piece of paper and a story. He had once been the secretary to a prince by the name of Count Spada, the last in his name. Spada was a good friend, and though his family was rumored to be extremely rich, Faria never really saw any of it. All he saw was Spada combing through the library at all hours of the day and night. One night, after a bit too much wine, Spada explained why. During the reign of Pope Borgia, the papacy needed cash, so the Pope sold 2 very rich men the position of cardinal. He also sold their former positions to others. As if simony wasn't enough, Borgia then invited the men to a feast, where they left with some pretty terrible indigestion. Who's to say if it was the poison or the poison, but they died hours later. Well, Borgia's men stormed the late cardinal's homes, looking for their immense riches. They found one guy's treasure, but the other cardinal was Spada. His house seemed only full of libraries and laboratories and almost no money. In his will, Spada left his family all of his riches, his books, and most importantly, a book with golden corners, which he hoped they would preserve in remembrance of him. Hint, hint, hint. They didn't get the hint. As the family line continued on through the centuries, some became soldiers, others bankers, others churchmen. Some grew rich, some lost everything, and finally the last in the line hired a young priest as his secretary. Upon learning the story, Faria understood why the cash-strapped Count Spada combed his library. The books were mentioned in the will. He was looking tirelessly for that fortune that Spada had evidently hidden away. It was in that library, after Spada died and left Faria all that he owned, that Faria had a mishap after a nap and accidentally set fire to a book with golden corners. Half the letters revealed themselves before vanishing forever, and Faria had the presence of mind to remember them. He tore out the page and kept it, reproducing the other half of the message from memory. The fortune of Cardinal Spada was on the island of Monte Cristo. Faria found that message the night he was arrested. There were 2 million Roman crowns, 30 million of Edmund's currency, and with inflation in 2018, that fortune would be worth about $600 million in modern-day US dollars. Presented with all the proof that Faria had, Edmund could no longer help but believe his friend. That was it. He would get Faria out of here. He would get him to Monte Cristo so he could have his inheritance. Our inheritance, Faria corrected. He'd remained celibate throughout his life, but if he had ever had a son, he couldn't possibly love that person more than he did Edmund. Embracing the younger man with his good arm, Faria explained that Edmund was the only son he would ever have. Following the priest's instructions, Edmund filled in the hole underneath the guard shack, if only as a precaution. If the guards realized that the path they walked was hollow, they might investigate. It was a good thing, too, because later that year, they did renovations on the prison and completely rebuilt that section of the stronghold, filling it in with fresh, hard stone. Anyway, Edmund was still resolute in making good on his promise, and he decided he would stay with his friend until he died. Edmund committed the instructions to finding the treasure to memory, but not for him. He knew that he would never make it out of the cell, or if he did, he might be as old as Faria. The plan was that, after Faria died, Edmund would come to the man who took his place in the cell. Edmund would be the new Faria, bringing another prisoner out of despair and darkness, and maybe concocting a new plan of escape. One morning, as Edmund crawled through the tunnels to visit his friend, he heard it, a loud thud. He rushed as fast as he could and found Faria, as he dreaded, on the ground. The third attack had come. Faria said his goodbyes, though he still had medicine left. Why was he giving up? Edmund was confused and waited until the priest again fell motionless, as if dead. Edmund pried open his teeth with the knife, dropped the medicine in, and waited 10 minutes, then 20, then an hour. Tears filled Edmund's eyes. His friend wasn't waking up. Stiff as a board, Edmund thought to himself. Stiff as a board. The doctor had come by the following morning. They had seared Faria's flesh to make sure that he was, indeed, dead. He was set that evening to be taken to the cemetery of Chateau d'If. When the officials had left, Edmund found his old friend knit up in a burlap sack, prepared for burial. The priest, knife in hand, Edmund considered cutting his own throat. Solitude was an agonizing torture that pushed him to the edge of sanity, and he didn't want to be alone again. Holding the knife and looking at the priest, it was then that he had another idea. Edmund clenched his jaw as he tried to be stiff as a corpse. The priest would forgive him, he hoped. Besides, Faria would get a proper burial. After. Once the idea entered his mind, he forced himself not to think about it until he was in the dead man's burlap sack, and Faria was in his bed. From the inside, Edmund tugged the stitching closed again, cinching up the burial bag around him, and waited. He had been watching from the walls when the doctor talked about what they were going to do with the priest. He was going to be taken to the cemetery at Chateau d'If. All Edmund needed to do was get outside the walls and dive into the sea. It had been nearly 15 years since he'd gone swimming, but he would leave his survival in God's hands. He would be buried alive in the present cemetery, and the moment the dirt settled, he would cut himself free and dig himself out. After that, he just needed to dive off the nearest cliff, avoid the sharpshooters, and swim to safety. All right, no big deal. He had as much of a chance of survival as they did the other time they were thinking about escaping. It was getting late, and the workers were growing tired of carrying such a heavy, emaciated priest. It was ridiculous. Halfway there, one grabbed a wheelbarrow and shot the other an "I told you so" look through the darkness. Edmund could hear a storm raging all around him as he felt the wheelbarrow bumping along the stones. Finally, they came to a stop. Edmund expected to hear shovels. Instead, he heard chains. It was when he felt the chains being looped around his legs that he began to panic. He willed every ounce of him to remain still, but panic grew with every second. It wasn't until the workers hoisted him up into the air, making him feel weightless, if only for a moment, before the heavy pull of the chains on his feet made him realize what was happening. The cemetery at Chateau d'If was the sea. Edmund saw the goat and fired. It got away, of course. It was supposed to get away. Edmund heard a gunshot from the ship. Dinner was ready. He looked back at the rock, took a deep breath, and began his sprint back to camp. He yelled as he approached, so the men would know he was on his way. They had to know he was coming. Everyone looked up and motioned for Edmund to hurry. To get down there, Jacopo had shot a goat, and there was enough for everyone. But the smiles faded as they watched Edmund take 3 steps when leaping across slick river rocks, and then go down hard. They heard a scream, and then silence. They saw the blood mingling with the creek water when they got close, and Jacopo was the first one to try to rouse his friend. He poured a few ounces of rum in Edmund's mouth, and soon Edmund was awake and groaning. His ribs were broken. Well, one of them was, at least. There was no way he could get to the ship. The men looked at him, and then at the ship that was like just 200 yards out of the forest. They could do it. They weren't going to leave him on a deserted island alone to die. The captain even said he would delay the deal. Sure, they were smugglers, and delaying the deal put them in a sort of precarious Han Solo Jabba the Hutt situation, but Edmund was their best sailor on board, and frankly, a friend to everyone. Edmund refused. He had really been in worse spots than this. All he needed was a bit of food, a gun, a pickaxe, and a tent, and he could lay there and heal while they made their deal and came back for him. It took a lot of convincing, and Edmund all but commanding his best friend on board, Jacopo, to go too, before the men left him way more provisions than he asked for, and, in the light of the afternoon sinking to evening, Edmund watched the ship sail away, leaving him alone on the island of Monte Cristo. Edmund had found that ship the night he escaped from Chateau d'If, nearly a year ago. It had been a surprise to not have been buried alive, but instead flung over a cliff into the sea. And if he hadn't had the knife from Faria, he would have drowned in that burlap bag. Luckily, he cut himself loose, lost the chains, surfaced, and swam for his life. The storm only grew worse, and it was a miracle that he made it to one of the islands, the one to which he and Faria had planned a rendezvous way back when. This, however, was where things took an unexpected turn. Illuminated by a lightning crack, Edmund first saw the silhouette of a small ship approaching. With the next bolt, he realized that it was sinking. Beneath the sporadic spotlight, he dove frantically into the water after one of the overboard crewmen and actually managed to drag him ashore, despite his own fatigue, only to find that the man had died when the ship hit the rocks. Edmund looked at the man's clothes and cap and at his own ragged prison clothes. He begged forgiveness from the dead man as he stripped him and stashed his body in the forest, just in time to see the second ship, the ship we just saw leaving Monte Cristo a year later, approaching. Having seen the first ship crash into the rocks, the crew of the second ship was astonished to see anyone alive after that wreck. They pulled Edmund aboard from the water, and Edmund, being a trained sailor, guided the weathered crew safely through the storm, just in time for the cannons to go off and the beacons to be lit at Chateau d'If, notifying the area that a prisoner had escaped. The captain eyed Edmund, the man they just picked up from a wreck who, with his shaggy hair and beard, looked just like a convict. He thought about the cannons at Chateau d'If and about this experienced sailor who would help them through the storm, and decided that he didn't need to know what he didn't know. Edmund, for his part, was happy for the ship he found. They were smugglers, people who needed no extra incentive to sail clear of the authorities. At the next stop, the captain hired Edmund, who promptly shaved and cut his hair before resuming his life at sea. It was difficult, of course. He knew he couldn't go back to Marseille. Not yet. If people remembered his name, then that would be the first place they would look. They would go to his father, to Mercedes, if she even remembered him. It took months of Edmund working aboard the ship until one day, as they passed the island of Elba, the captain asked Edmund if he knew of a nearby deserted island where they could spend a day to gather some food and water. Trying to keep his hands from shaking with excitement, Edmund pointed to the island of Monte Cristo on the map. This crew had been the very men who saw him slip and break his ribs on the rocks. They had been the ones to leave him. They were the ones that didn't see him spring to his feet as soon as the ship dipped below the horizon. He wiped the blood from his head, made from a small cut after he hit the ground. He looked to the sky and figured he had another hour before nightfall. He closed his eyes and replayed the directions that Faria had drilled into his mind over and over again. Edmund followed the path seared into his mind, and, after some difficulty with a giant stone and some gunpowder, blew away the opening to the grottos that had been sealed for 300 years. His heart beat faster as he descended into the darkness, coming at last to an empty part of the cave. So far, everything was just as Faria said it would be. The ground was dirt, undisturbed. If the treasure was here at all, it would be in the back corner. He hefted his pickaxe high above his shoulder and brought it crashing down. After a few hits, the pickaxe made a different sound. Edmund threw it down and shoveled the dirt away with his hands until he found a casket. He breathed deeply and opened it. Six months later, he sat back and sighed. He looked out at his ostentatious Paris mansion that he had bought, and he grinned. Every so often, he had to remind himself that all of this was real, that he was here, that he didn't have to fight and scheme anymore. When he'd lost the command of the ferry all those years ago and had to go away, he thought his life was over, that he would never be free, all because of that stupid letter that Fernand had sent to Villefort. But now, he was free in every possible way. He had used his initial income to invest and grow his worth in such a short time that everyone considered him blessed. They didn't care who he was or where he came from. All they cared about was the money. He slid the bag of gold into a drawer and closed the desk. It was new. Everything was new. Surrounding himself in luxury and beauty helped him to forget his past. He even had a title of nobility now. He had so much money and power that no one would ever tell him what to do again. There was a knock at the door as a servant there let himself in to announce that the guests had arrived. The Count de Morcerf and the Countess were here. Danglars smiled. It would be good to see Fernand again. Even after all these years, seeing Fernand Mondego remind Danglars of Marseille. After Napoleon returned, Danglars had left and made millions investing and speculating. He'd married, which made him even more millions, and had given him the title of Baron Danglars. He'd moved to Paris, to one of the biggest houses on one of the most fashionable streets, and he was surprised that Fernand was already there. The kid had always been a bit of a coward, but it paid off for him when it mattered most. When out fighting for Napoleon, he'd followed his general and defected to the British the night before the battle. After Napoleon fell and the king was restored, again, Fernand was lauded as a hero. He was promoted and took a station in Spain where, by a stroke of luck, he helped turn the tide of war. He was then promoted to colonel and given the title Count de Morcerf. Next, he went to France and entered the service of a very rich man who promptly died and left him an absurd amount of money. After that, he set himself and his wife up in Paris, where he invested with his friend, Baron Danglars. They were friends with writers, journalists, bankers, politicians, and kings. These two men who had grown up far from Paris, Fernand without a cent to his name and Danglars with only a few, now not only survived in Parisian high society, but thrived. They also had something else in common. They, more so than anyone else, were responsible for Edmond's imprisonment. But unlike Edmond, who had burned with anger for them ever since Faria helped him piece it all together, they didn't think about Edmond at all. "I'm an honest man," the innkeeper said. He was 45, but he looked like he was 60. The priest sitting across from him, his only guest, drained a glass of wine. "So much the better for you. If what you say is true, sooner or later, the good will be rewarded and the wicked punished. Now, I believe you're exactly the person I was looking for. Monsieur Caderousse, is it?" Caderousse nodded. The priest asked him if he knew a young sailor from a few years back in Marseille, before Caderousse moved to the middle of nowhere to burn all of his money owning an inn. Caderousse gasped. His eyes ignited with a kind of feverish intensity at the mention of Edmond. Yes, he and Edmond had been good friends. They were neighbors once. He had been arrested. What had happened to the poor sailor? The priest hung his head. He was sorry to inform such a dear friend of Edmond's, but the young man died in prison. A shiver ran down Caderousse's spine. He had to look away from the priest for a moment. What he had always suspected, what he had always feared, had happened. They had done it, then. They had killed him. The priest continued, saying that he had been with Edmond the day he died. Many felons confessed their crimes to their priests on their deathbeds, even ones that had been so insistent on their innocence. Edmond, though, was intransigent to the last. He remained completely ignorant of his crimes. Caderousse shook his head. That was true. The priest gasped. Then you know? Caderousse shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He took another long look at the wine bottle. The priest continued. Edmond Dantes had asked him to deliver something to the only 4 friends that he knew. The priest took out a small box and placed it on the table. It was a diamond. On the inside, Edmond had made friends with an Englishman who had the good fortune to be released after Louis XVIII took the throne again. He had gifted it to his friend for Edmond to start a new life when Edmond left. The time came when Edmond knew he would never get out. When he knew he was dying, Edmond asked the priest to sell it and divide the money between the 5 people he loved most in the world. Edmond's father, his betrothed, his dear, dear friend Caderousse, a man by the name of Danglars, and another man who was almost his family, Fernand Mondego. Caderousse's eyes went to the floor as the priest continued, saying that he had already been to Marseille. That list of 5 was already down to 4. The elder Dantes, Edmond's father, had died while he was in prison. The priest couldn't help but ask, how did he die? Caderousse sighed. In the end, it was starvation. The priest had to hide his hands as they shook with rage. Starvation? Dogs living on the street don't die of starvation. Caderousse explained that it was a different time. After the second restoration of the king, everyone was scared. and Edmund had gone to prison for helping the usurper. No one wanted to be seen helping the father of a traitor. So the guy wasted away. The priest sat back in the shadows to hide the lone tear that streaked down his face. Carissa took another look at the box that contained the diamond. As for the other 3 people, they weren't Edmund's friends, and they didn't need the money now. They had millions, and surely they would crush Carissa should they ever learn he talked. But looking around, he wasn't that far off from being crushed anyway, and for the sake of Edmund, he had to say something. He had been haunted by that day for 15 years, and if God allowed him to live another 15, it would still keep him up at night. He had a story to tell. An hour later, the priest rode off. When he was far enough away, Edmund took off the tricorn hat and long coat. Faria had been right the whole time. And after Edmund had been taken away, it had become so much worse. Fernand, a war hero, Danglars a baron and a millionaire. His old boss, Monsieur Morel, had ruined his reputation trying to free Edmund, and was now down to his last ship, the Pharian, the one on which Edmund had been the first mate, the one that he was supposed to captain 15 years ago. It was late, too, and if it didn't make it, Morel, Edmund's patron, and the one friend that had remained, and petitioned long after the others had given up, well, Morel will be destitute. And Mercedes was the worst of all. As for Carissa, Edmund knew the type of man Carissa was. At least, he knew who Carissa had been years ago. Now, he had a test before him. A sudden influx of wealth doesn't change a person, it reveals them. The priest, shocked by the betrayal of the poor captain, had given Carissa the diamond, worth 50,000 francs, which was a literal boatload of money. Back at the inn, Carissa's wife coughed from the stairs as she descended, looking wide-eyed and in awe at the diamond. This could save them. Carissa narrowed his eyes at her. Of course it could, if it was real. The woman laughed. The gift giver was a priest. Of course it was real. Carissa shook his head. His eyes darted to the wine bottle, then back. He knew it was late afternoon, but if he rode quickly, he could make it to town and get it appraised. His wife was too sick to follow him outside, but over the questions of why he needed to go today and what would happen if they had a guest, Carissa brusquely put on his coat and shoes. She had to go back to bed. The excitement and the sudden salvation had exacerbated her illness, and she was asleep by the time he rode off, in the opposite direction of town. Monsieur Morel's finger fiddled with the trigger. 11 a.m. He would be dead by 11 a.m. He had received word 3 months ago from an Englishman named Lord Wilmore that the stranger's firm had bought his debts, and they would be payable on September 5th. It was minutes later that Morel learned that his final ship, the Pharian, had gone down on the way back from Calcutta, and with it, it took all hope of Monsieur Morel being able to pay his debts. He was 287,000 francs in the hole, and he'd gone into even more debt paying his sailors' final salaries. It was the right thing to do. He didn't need to make his misfortune their misfortune. He had tried desperately to call in any lines of credit he could, and any assistance available from friends, but the once beloved businessman had no one left. Everyone had abandoned him, either because of his poverty or his politics. He knew what was left, and that had been communicated in his not at all subtle final words to his creditor. If he lived, he would have the man's money. Now, he sat on his bed, listening to the shop bustle beneath him. When the shot rang out, his family would mourn, but they would be saved. His debts would die with him, and the family would be pitied for their loss, not scorned for Morel's failure. Blood would wash away dishonor. He looked out the window, took one last look at Marseille, and raised the pistol to his head. That was when he heard it. Something between a screeching and a laughing downstairs. Then, dozens of feet pounding up the stairs and making straight for his door. Morel stashed the weapon when he heard the door wasn't going to stop them. His family bounded in, beaming. They were saved. Years ago, Monsieur Morel had given what money he could spare in his favorite red purse to an old friend of Edmond Dantes. It was to a perpetually down-on-his-luck tailor by the name of Catarossa. Morel was a little perturbed to not get the purse back, and he had no way of knowing that, in exchange for a diamond, an enigmatic priest had secured that red bag, donned a suit and a British accent, and bought the apartment where Edmond's father had died. That same British businessman was also representing the firm that bought most of Morel's debts, and he left a note to Morel's daughter saying that in 3 months' time, when the debts came due, and she received a letter from a stranger named Sinbad the Sailor, that she should do what it said. She did, and the note that morning led her, alone, to some old apartment. There, sitting on the mantel, was a red purse containing the entirety of Morel's business debts. Morel asked what the address was, and froze. The 5th floor of that apartment building was one that he knew very well. He started to think about it, but was roused from thought by even more shocking news. The Pharian, the ship that the entire crew had watched sink, had returned. Knowing that that news had to be a mistake, Morel, his wife, son, and daughter ran down to the docks. But there, sitting at anchor, with the entirety of its last cargo on board, was the Pharian. Morel couldn't believe it. He was saved. Dropping to his knees, and with tears streaking down his face, he praised God. Mid-sentence, something caught Morel's eye. He couldn't explain it, but you just get used to seeing the way someone stands. And the man standing far off on a yacht looked just like someone he had once known. A brave and talented and good man. The sun was at the stranger's back, so Morel couldn't see anything other than his silhouette. He didn't know if the man was an angel, or Edmond, somehow returning from the dead to save him in his time of need. But to him, there wasn't much of a difference. He looked to the Pharian, and then back to the stranger. But the man was already at the helm of his yacht, sailing it out of the harbor. Of course, the Pharian had sunk on its way back from Calcutta. The hardest part wasn't trying to reassemble the decades-old ship. That was easy. Edmond had sailed on its maiden voyage. The Pharian was his ship, the one that he was supposed to captain. He knew every plank and bolt on that vessel. No, the difficult part was reassembling the crew, who had scattered looking for work. He hired them back on, and a few months later, they sailed the Pharian back into port, helmed by some guy named Jacobo, who dove off the boat just before it dropped anchor and swam to the mysterious man piloting the yacht. Mercedes kissed her son goodnight, but took her time going to bed herself. Sometimes she would just sit on her own until the small hours of the morning, thinking. Her husband was already in bed, and though she loved him, seeing an old friend that night had reminded her. She shut away her jewels and took off her beautiful dress, a dress that she never would have even seen growing up penniless in Marseille, let alone worn. She had become a different person in the past 15 years. She had to, because whenever she went back to Marseille in her mind, to the happy girl she once was, all she thought about was him. She delicately wiped the tears and entered her bedroom, where her husband was snoring. As Fernand slept, Mercedes slid into bed beside him. She had married him 18 months after Edmond had been taken away. And even on the way to her own ceremony, she nearly fainted when she passed the place where Edmond was arrested. She had always loved Fernand as a brother, and after Edmond disappeared, Fernand was all she had left. He returned from war as someone who had the means to take her out of Marseille, away from the place where her every waking thought was of Edmond. So she left. Fernand had surprised her, and everyone else for that matter. He became a war hero, a count, and a very rich man. but he was still the same Fernand, just as she was still the same Mercedes. They'd never spoken of it, but the specter of Edmond Dantes haunted their marriage, as well as the thoughts of Mercedes, who, laying as she had on countless nights before, staring at her magnificent Parisian bedroom, thought of Edmond, her first love, and what their life might have been. That's it for this run of the Count of Monte Cristo this season. Next time we catch up with Edmond, 10 more years will have passed, and he will have bought the island where his treasure resides. Then, he'll go not to Paris, but to Rome, to rescue a young man, to secure his entrance into Parisian high society. That young man will be none other than the Viscount of Morcerf, and Mercedes' son, Albert. Now, it's time for the best of the worst. The villains this time are Dumfries Tweed and Deaver Tweed. If that sounds like a clumsy literary reference, you're absolutely right. They're also known as Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Okay, so I love Batman. He's my absolute favorite superhero, period. That being said, if you're a villain and Batman has bumbled into a bear trap and you have the opportunity to kill Batman, kill Batman. Don't let him just sit there and taste defeat, or don't try to send him a message. Your plan might not work if you kill him, but you will absolutely fail if you don't. It's all the more impressive that Tweedledee and Tweedledum were able to incapacitate Batman twice in the same issue, because they have no superpowers, no particularly great intelligence or strength. In fact, they are just two very rotund criminals with an affinity for Alice in Wonderland and for not exercising ever. Also, they bounce, because, okay. Batman and Robin tracked them down by going to, quote, Fat Man's Emporium, a big and tall shop that needed some work on their branding, but didn't really care because they were the only store of this type in Gotham. Not at all suspicious that the local multimillionaire popped in with his friend, who was a young boy, asking about some of their best customers. The store owner gave them directions to Tweedledee and Tweedledum's house, which, okay, another supervillain point. If you're going to engage in supervillainy, don't give out your home address. Tweedledee and Tweedledum looked at how babies live and must have thought, yes, awesome, and enjoyed being carried everywhere by their henchmen, not wanting to exert themselves in the slightest. I mean, I get it, exercise is the worst, but also, if they lost weight, they'd need to find a new gimmick. Better to just earn the undying resentment of those serving you, and make them feed you and carry you everywhere. Okay, if your elaborate trap for Batman requires 2 costume changes and weeks of rehearsal, but still boils down to guys in bunny suits machine gunning Batman and Robin at a tea party, it's too complicated. Tweedledee and Tweedledum were caught and sent to Arkham. Despite a lack of superpowers and disdain for any movement whatsoever, Tweedledee and Tweedledum escaped numerous times. As we talked about previously, the world has changed a lot since the 40s, and in the 90s, while trying to rob a bank, the Gotham Police Department was having none of their shenanigans, and Tweedledum was shot in the head. Because just one Lewis Carroll aficionado committing crimes by himself is just ridiculous, Deaver Tweed calls up yet another rotund cousin, who not only fits in Tweedledum's costume, but goes by the name of Dumpson Tweed, so they don't even need to change the stationery. That's it for this week. Today's episode was written by me, Jason Weiser, and edited by Carissa Weiser. Our theme song is by the amazing Breakmaster Cylinder. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.